Boa tarde. Vamos continuar a nossa querida Flip 2014 com a mesa 3, Fabulação e Mistério. É uma mesa que será mediada pelo José Luiz Passos, que em 2013 praticamente morou aqui na tenda. Esteve em 3 ou 4 discussões. Então está em boas mãos o nosso par de escritores. É a primeira vez que uma autora neozelandesa vem para a Flip. Então agradecemos e convidamos outros escritores do país a vir para cá. E o suíço Joël Dicker. Muito obrigado. Vamos começar.
Muito bem. Bem-vindos à mesa número 3, a Flip que homenageia Milor Fernandes. É um prazer estar aqui de volta. No ano passado eu tinha barba e hoje eu não tenho mais barba porque os meus convidados são tão jovens que, de alguma maneira, eu tinha que me encaixar na programação sem deixar os meus convidados por fora. Eu queria começar agradecendo ao Paulo pelo convite de moderar essa mesa. Fiquei muito contente com o convite, porque na altura em que ele me fez o convite, eu estava, de fato, lendo, por acaso, um dos romances de hoje. Essa é conhecida como a Mesa dos Livros Finos. Vocês terão a oportunidade de escutar um pouco. A plateia terá a oportunidade de fazer perguntas. Nós não aceitaremos perguntas com menos de 20 páginas, porque seria uma vergonha, né? Afinal, eles escreveram bastante. Antes de começar a moderação, eu queria dizer que 4 pessoas invisíveis estão aqui conosco e eu queria prestigiá-las, os tradutores simultâneos ou intérpretes, Chris Peterson e Ana Viana, estão fazendo a tradução simultânea, e os tradutores André Teles e Fábio Bonillo, que fizeram as traduções dos livros que serão lidos, os trechos que serão lidos. É importante reconhecer os nossos tradutores, aqueles que fazem a comunicação. Eles são responsáveis por fazer a nossa literatura viajar e também as de fora chegarem aqui. Então, é isso. Agora, os ingressos estão muito disputados. Eu ouvi falar, Paulo me falou agora que a FIFA mandou 2 cambistas. Se você está do lado de fora, no telão, senhora, por favor, procure o cambista da FIFA. E os ingressos de R$3.000 ainda estão disponíveis. Então, Fabulação e Mistério, eu acho que nos convida a pensar um pouco na estruturação de histórias que precisam de outras histórias para serem contadas ou para serem, digamos, esclarecidas e tornadas interessantes, palpáveis para os leitores. É um desafio comentar 2 romances tão interessantes e complexos e com essa extensão. Então, a ideia que eu tive para a mesa de hoje é permitir que os autores apresentem as suas obras, nas suas próprias palavras, leiam um trecho, e depois nós montamos algumas perguntas mais gerais para fazer com que vocês tenham um maior conhecimento da trajetória de ambos. Obviamente, são 2 autores vergonhosamente jovens e bem-sucedidos. Então, eu gostaria que eles falassem também sobre a experiência desse sucesso recente e da preparação de narrativas, como eu disse, tão complexas e interessantes. Agora, Eleanor Catton, nascida no Canadá, radicada na Nova Zelândia, onde ela reside, fez um mestrado em escrita criativa, cujo projeto resultou num primeiro romance, O Ensaio, publicado em 2008. Em 2009, ela participou do programa de Iowa, do Iowa Writers Workshop, que é um programa de muito prestígio. E em 2013 publicou Os Luminares, sucesso absoluto, vencedor do Man Booker Prize, talvez um dos prêmios de maior prestígio de literatura de língua inglesa. É um romance histórico, montado sob uma estrutura astrológica, localizado na Nova Zelândia do meio do século XIX, em uma zona de mineração. Então eu vou pedir que Ellie descreva um pouco o romance para vocês e leia o trecho escolhido para que, na sequência, nós passemos ao próximo autor e às perguntas. Ellie, welcome. So now, if you could tell us a little bit about your novel and read from it.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks all for coming. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first ever time in South America. And I just arrived last night, so I'm still a little bit jet-lagged, but very excited. As Zay was saying, the Luminaries is set in a little town on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island called Hokitika. It's a Māori name. And the town in the mid-19th century really kind of exploded to life with one of New Zealand's gold rushes. There were several in the 1860s. It was a part of New Zealand that really interested me because this was completely uninhabited land before gold was discovered there. Even the Māori presence there was very patchy. There weren't really any settlements to speak of. And then when gold was discovered, all of a sudden, thousands of people were flocking to the region, and the town was kind of birthed out of nothing. So it's a part of New Zealand I'm very fond of, and I know quite well. And in writing the book, I shaped the narrative around astrological star charts, in the sense that each one of the characters in the book is patterned on an astrological archetype, and their choreography, their movements in and around one another's lives follows the motion of the planets through the 12 signs of the zodiac over the year when I set the novel in 1866. So that kind of just gives you a little bit of an idea of what's afoot. But in terms of what's happening on the ground in the novel rather than in the sky, it's a murder mystery. And I'll just read the very beginning to give you an idea. The 12 men congregated in the smoking room of the Crown Hotel gave the impression of a party accidentally met. From the variety of their comportment and dress, frock coats, tailcoats, Norfolk jackets with buttons of horn, yellow moleskin, cambric and twill, they might have been 12 strangers on a railway car, each bound for a separate quarter of a city that possessed fog and tides enough to divide them. Indeed, the studied isolation of each man as he pored over his paper or leaned forward to tap his ashes into the grate or placed the splay of his hand upon the baize to take his shot at billiards conspired to form the very type of bodily silence that occurs late in the evening on a public railway, deadened here not by the slur and clunk of the coaches, but by the fat clatter of the rain. Such was the perception of Mr. Walter Moody from where he stood in the doorway with his hand upon the frame. He was innocent of having disturbed any kind of private conference, for the speakers had ceased when they heard his tread in the passage. By the time he opened the door, each of the 12 men had resumed his occupation, rather haphazardly on the part of the billiard players, for they had forgotten their places, with such a careful show of absorption that no one even glanced up when he stepped into the room. The strictness and uniformity with which the men ignored him might have aroused Mr. Moody's interest had he been himself in body and temperament. As it was, he was queasy and disturbed. He had known the voyage to West Canterbury would be fatal at worst, an endless rolling trough of white water and spume that ended on the shattered graveyard of the Hokitika Bar, but he had not been prepared for the particular horrors of the journey, of which he was still incapable of speaking, even to himself. Moody was by nature impatient of any deficiencies in his own person. Fear and illness both turned him inward, and it was for this reason that he very uncharacteristically failed to assess the tenor of the room he had just entered. Thanks.
Joël Dicker, suíço de Genebra, estudou na França, possui mestrado em Direito da Universidade de Genebra e escreveu um primeiro romance chamado Os Últimos Dias dos Nossos Pais, 2012. E, mais recentemente, ou logo em seguida, na verdade, é incrível, a verdade sobre o caso Harry Cabet. O livro foi um sucesso imediato de vendas, contratos para traduções em 32 línguas. É um livro fascinante, que nos oferece a possibilidade de repensar o gênero policial, também como um gênero, digamos, através de uma pegada ou de uma chave metanarrativa, metatextual. Há vários livros dentro do livro em que um jovem escritor bloqueado, com o qual eu me identifiquei, tenta esclarecer o crime supostamente cometido por um amigo, escritor e mentor que escreveu um livro de muito sucesso na década de 70. O livro é fascinante e, a despeito da diferença de localização geográfica e temporal, se comunica de modo muito interessante com o livro de Eleanor Catton. Então, Joël, se você pudesse descrever um pouco o seu livro e ler o trecho selecionado, eu agradeceria.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my very first time in Brazil as you. It's a pleasure to be with you because it's the first time I met Eleanor, but I've heard a lot about you, and I'm very impressed by the size of your book. It's pretty impressive to be here, first of all, because I've heard a lot about Parati, but it's something to hear about it, and it's something else to be here. It's very impressive to be in front of such a big crowd. I'm expecting Justin Timberlake to come after or something like that. And it's actually the first time a place is so crowded for my book, and half of the crowd is not part of like my parents or cousins or people like that. So thank you very much for being here today. The story of this book that they just told you, so it's the story of Marcus Goldman. He's a young author, about 30 years old, and he just faced a success. And on his way to try to write his next novel, he's facing a writer's block because he don't know what to write about. And this is a story of his relationship with his mentor, Harry Kuber, who was his professor at the university and who became his friend. And it's going to be the story, of course, of the past friendship between those two men, but also the story of a fight between a pupil that is becoming more powerful than the mentor that made him the man he was. So it's also very special for me to be here because this is the sixth book that I wrote, but this is the second one that is published and the first one that I published here in Brazil. And the thing is, I wrote this book in my grandmother's apartment, and I had no idea of what I wanted to write. The only thing I had in mind was to have some pleasure for myself, to have the pleasure of my own storytelling, because I was like, I have no guarantee that this book will be read by anyone, and the only thing that I can make sure is the pleasure that I will get from writing the story. So that's why I wrote this book without any plan, without any idea of the plot, and I just followed my envies. I'm gonna read the prologue. Actually, I'm going to read the prologue. It's in English. As you can hear, I'm not an English-speaking person. I'm Swiss. I speak French. So it's not exactly my book I'm going to read. It's the translation, excellent translation, from Sam Taylor. So if you don't like it, it's not me. My book was the talk of the town. I could no longer walk the streets of Manhattan in peace. I could no longer go jogging without passers-by recognizing me and calling out, "Look, it's Goldman, it's that writer." Some even started running after me so they could ask the questions that were gnawing at them. "Is it true what you say in your book? Did Harry Kuber really do that?" In the West Village Cafe, where I was a regular, certain customers felt free to sit at my table and talk to me. "I'm reading your book right now, Mr. Goldman. I can't put it down. The first one was good, of course, but this one, did they really pay you $2 million to write it? How old are you? I bet you're not even 30 and already a multimillionaire." Even the doorman at my building, whose progress through my book I was able to note each time I came or went, cornered me for a long time by the elevator once he had got to the end. So that's what happened to Nola Kerrigan, that poor girl. But how could it happen? How could such a thing be possible, Mr. Goldman? All of New York, the entire country, in fact, was going crazy for my book. Only two weeks had passed since its publication, and it already promised to be the best-selling book of the year. Everyone wanted to know what had happened in Somerset in 1975. They were talking about it everywhere, on TV, on the radio, in every newspaper, all over the internet. I was not even 30 years old, and I had, with this book, only the second of my career, become the most famous writer in the country. The case that had shocked the nation, and from which the core of my story was taken, had blown up several months earlier, at the beginning of summer, when the remains of a girl who had been missing for 33 years were discovered. So began the events described in this book, without which the rest of the country will never even have heard of the little town of Somerset, New Hampshire. Thank you.
Uma das coisas mais fascinantes, pelo menos para mim como leitor, na leitura dos dois livros, particularmente na leitura em conjunto que eu fiz da preparação para a mesa, é o fato de que os dois romances são romances de estrutura. Os romances de estrutura são aqueles romances em que o próprio design do caminho, do arco narrativo, da concatenação entre as partes, ele está relativamente aparente e ele é fator participante, de modo mais ativo, no desenvolvimento do enredo, na mecânica ou na dinâmica entre as personagens. Esses são romances que, na verdade, lançam mão de pequenas leis, na verdade, não de pequenas leis, mas de leis e de lógicas muito peculiares para estruturar o encaminhamento do enredo e para dar sentido à vida das personagens. Então, a pergunta ou o tema que eu gostaria de discutir com vocês agora é justamente essa característica que eu acho que é uma conquista da imaginação nos romances de vocês, tanto no sentido propriamente muscular, no sentido do esforço impressionante de organização de estruturas narrativas longas, mas extremamente com muito design, ou seja, extremamente eficientes e com sentido e coerência e coerências admiráveis, mas também a função que essa estrutura possui. No caso de Ellie, obviamente nós temos digamos, essa mitologia astrológica encaminhando o sentido, ou dando sentido às vidas e à movimentação das personagens, num quadro de relativo, digamos, determinismo nas expectativas da vida de cada um desses personagens. Você tem personalidades que são, ao mesmo tempo, predeterminadas e livres num contexto de interação. No caso do Joël, nós temos, por excelência, o romance policial. É um romance de estrutura. As coisas precisam acontecer para que pistas falsas sejam distribuídas ao longo da leitura e para que o leitor acompanhe possibilidades irrealizadas rumo ao esclarecimento. Ele faz disso uma estrutura ainda mais inteligente na medida em que você tem narrativas que competem por esse sentido dentro do marco total dos livros. Então, a pergunta sobre essa estrutura latente ou manifesta dentro da organização das narrativas. De onde é que vem, de onde veio, de onde nasceu essa ideia ou essa opção que vocês fizeram pela estrutura astrológica e pela estrutura, digamos, policial, metanarrativa, já que nós temos, inclusive, elementos de, digamos, quase que de educação do escritor de romance policial dentro do próprio romance. É um romance que se conta, se esclarece e funciona como um manual de escrita de um romance. De onde vem a ideia para essa estruturação e em que ponto ela se colocou como um princípio de organização desses livros?
Well, yes, I think that what I'd say about structure in general is that it is intimately connected with content, with what how you say something and what you're saying. It's impossible to divorce them, really. And so I think that, to foreground structure it must happen for a reason. And if it doesn't happen for a reason, it will always kind of bring a reason along with it before the end of the road. so for me, in the Luminaries, I was thinking about a Gold Rush novel. That kind of came first before the structural idea arrived. I was really interested in the period, and I had always felt that there was something really romantic about the idea of a gold rush, the idea of instant transformation that a gold rush promises. In a way, it's kind of a naive promise that if one became extremely rich, that would kind of be a kind of a release from oneself, or a possibility for reinvention. And so in kind of mulling these ideas over, I was naturally led to thinking about ideas of fate and ideas of free will. What is the relationship between fate and free will? Are we made by our fortunes, or do we make our fortunes? And obviously, in English at least, I don't know if this is the same in Portuguese, but the word fortune means both a lot of money and also your kind of cosmically determined fate. So all of this almost led me to the structure in a way that the zodiac, the system of the zodiac, this idea that there is this interrelated system that makes sense of our world, perhaps, or that we have created this system by projecting a kind of psychology onto the sky, and seen a pattern where actually there is only a chance scatter of stars. Like both of those possible interpretations of the zodiac spoke to what I was interested in anyway, and in that way the skeleton of the book kind of took shape. It was such an interesting system to learn about. I didn't know anything about astrology really before I started researching this book, and I hadn't been particularly interested in it either. But in learning about it, I was surprised to discover how incredibly mathematical it is, and even musical. The example that really illustrates that, I think, is that in the Western musical scale, we have 12 semitones to get from up an octave. But 7 natural notes, so 7 tones. And so you have a 12 laid over a 7, which is exactly the same as the zodiac. You have 7 planets and 12 signs. And all of these interrelations that you get in music, for example, the idea that a dominant chord, a 5 to a 1, sounds beautiful to us. And when we hear that, we feel, resolution, and we feel it's known as a major chord. We feel major when we hear that. That has equivalences in the sky, and so I was quite surprised to learn about the structural integrity of the zodiac as a system, and in a way it lent a kind of integrity to what I was doing formally. That I didn't bring to the project, that was kind of there already.
Joël?
Yeah, I kind of think that the structure of a book will give you the intensity or the dimension of the journey that you will make by reading a book. Because a story is a story, as a house is a house or a cake is a cake, it's very basic. But what will make a difference is the structure, and by structure I mean the hard work that you would like to do as an author. And that's a question that I've always wondered myself, and that I can't find any answer on an iBook, for instance, which is a device. It's a tablet. But when I look at Eleanor's book and I see already a physical thing, I have a feeling. I have the feeling that it's too long for me, or I have the feeling that it's the perfect book for a month on an island. Or I have the feeling that it's perfect for some reason or other, but there's a physical feeling that is going to define some feelings about the book and the story, which is not even related to the story itself. And what I mean is it's the exact same when you go into the book. The structure will give you the feeling. The structure will give you the intensity, as I said, of the journey, because you can tell the same story many times, but it's not the same if the structure is different. And for instance, in my book, it's a very basic story, if I can say so, because it's about the disappearance of a young girl, which is something, if I can say so, very not usual but banal. You know, it's something that could happen here in Europe, in Australia, whatever. So it's not about the crime itself. It's more about how people can see it and how people can see their life evolving around what happened. And on the ground of this banal disappearance, I've tried to build something about the truth and how we can see a same event with a very different point of view. For instance, if after here I'm leaving, I don't know, I take my car, even though I'm not driving here, I take my car and all of a sudden I brake on the street because there's a kid crossing and the guy behind will bump into me. I will say, who is this guy? I'm breaking down because there's a kid. I don't want to run over the kids. And the guy is not paying attention and he just bumped into me. That's my truth. But you can see the exact same scene from the guy who is driving carefully, and all of a sudden I'm braking, like I'm stopping in the middle of the street for no reason, according to him. And that's another truth. And I try to build the structure according to the truth of everybody. And the thing is, there is no one truth. There is as many truths as there is people witnessing, or as there is people involved in the same story. And I really think that the structure is something that is very independent of the story, of the style, of the element of the books. The structure is the whole art craft part of the book, I think.
Excelente, eu gostei muito que você tenha levantado a questão sobre a relativa desimportância do crime propriamente dito, ou do esclarecimento do crime, já que a nossa mesa tematiza a questão da fabulação, mas em conjunção com outro aspecto que liga os livros de vocês, que é a função do mistério como do mistério como estratégia de um livro que precisa acompanhar, digamos, estimular o desejo do leitor a seguir adiante. Então, uma conversa que nós tivemos hoje mais cedo, eu acho que no almoço e no encontro de moderação, nós discutimos um pouco a questão das exigências ou das demandas da estruturação de uma história de mistério, ou seja, a particularidade, e muito embora o crime não seja necessariamente o elemento central, a atmosfera ou a estratégia do mistério nos dois livros. Eu queria saber de vocês como foi o processo de desenvolver uma estrutura para manter um mistério vivo. Como é aprender a escrever? Os livros anteriores de vocês não são livros de mistério, nesse sentido. E, no entanto, esses dois livros são. Então, como foi aprender a escrever isso? Ellie, durante o almoço, me disse que o livro de mistério ele é fundamentalmente um livro sobre o leitor, para o leitor, voltado para os desejos do leitor. E você parece que concordou com isso aí. Então, como se preparar e organizar um livro de mistério? Em que sentido o mistério transforma o escritor em alguém que precisa prestar mais atenção ao seu leitor?
Yes, that's exactly right. I think that the genre of mystery is about who is being mystified. I mean, you know, learning how to control not only what the reader wants to know, but what they don't yet want to know, but you're going to try and make them want to know it. And learning how to master the art of decoy and red herrings and misdirection. It's very much like a magic act, I think, in a lot of ways. One of the books that I read when I was researching this book was a really marvelous book by I want to say reformed magician. I don't know if that's a real thing, but a former magician anyway in the United States. And the book's called How to Cheat at Everything. And in this book, the writer breaks down all sorts of different confidence tricks of all kinds, which I read, with great interest because I was interested in confidence tricks and how people come to be persuaded and tricked into giving things away or making business deals that are not necessarily the best business deals. And so I think that I suppose the thing that I learned from this book, How to Cheat at Everything, is that most confidence tricks work by playing upon the credulity of the person who's being tricked, by in some way giving them a flattering version of themselves. They're forms of flattery, really, and they involve the trickster knowing with a huge degree of certainty exactly how a person is going to behave, and in a way they're like little mystery stories all on their own. And so for me, writing this book, it was a real test in a way. I found it extremely difficult but very rewarding to be thinking about the reader at all times. And for me personally, I was aware as the book got bigger and bigger as I was writing it that the contract that I was entering into with the imaginary reader was getting more and more acute. That when you write a long book, you're making a promise to your reader that you're saying, look, this is going to be worth your time. There's going to be a payoff of some kind. If I say that this is a mystery, there's going to be a mystery. And it was a hard road, I think, but I think that it's changed the way that I feel about writing in general. I think that I wouldn't be able to. I think that I will only write mysteries from now on, in a way.
Good. In my case, how to keep the mystery going on for this book, it was quite easy. I had no idea of who was the murderer till the end of the book, which is a good thing. And at some point, I had to pick someone and say, okay, basta, I need to close the story, But it's true, because it was not really supposed to be a mystery novel. It became a mystery novel. I don't really know why and how. And at some point, I was like, okay, now I really need to make this story to be some kind of mystery novel by picking a murderer and making this murderer being credible. It cannot be someone that just came out page 600 and something. It must be someone that was here from the beginning. Otherwise, the reader will say it's like cheating, And I really think, and it's very interesting what you just said about the fact that the book needs to be worthful for the reader. He needs to read the book and say, I didn't waste my time by reading it. And that's something very important that I didn't really have in mind when I wrote this book, because I was not absolutely sure that someone will really read the book, because at that time I had already 5 books rejected by all the publishing house that I sent it to. So I had no clue that it could be a real physical book. But the thing is, I do believe that there is a game between the readers and the author, and that the author should keep in mind that he's only responsible for, I would say, 50% of the work. I'm talking right now to you because you are listening to me, which means that I'm doing only 50% of the work. You, by staying here, are playing with me. And I will say in the book, it's quite the exact same. You have to leave enough room for the readers to create their own scenario, sets, characters. I don't really believe in books that will describe everything. You don't, for instance, if I take a very basic example, if I say let's think of a dragoon. You say dragoon in English? A dragon? Yeah, sorry. If I say let's all think of a dragon, let's take 2 seconds and let's think of a dragon, I'm absolutely sure that we all here are thinking of the exact same thing. Some kind of big lizard, not existing, spitting fire. And the thing is, it's not important to to precise if I think that he's green or yellow, or if he's that big, or if he has wings or not. It's not the point. I know that if I say a dragon, I know that you can all recall to this because it's part of the cliché that we all have. And I think that the game with the reader is a game with the cliché, because by using the cliché, in the good sense of the word, you will make room enough for the reader to do his 50% of the job of creating with you. And I really think that a book is nothing else than an object, but it really becomes a story. It really becomes something to share between the author and the readers at the moment that you're trying to create this connection, and that you realize as an author that it's going to be a book only if there's room for the readers.
Concordo. Isso me leva justamente à próxima pergunta, que é uma extensão dessa reflexão que nós fizemos entre fabulação, ou estrutura, e a função do mistério. A despeito, ou apesar de toda essa ênfase digamos, num peso relativo pronunciado da imaginação, ou seja, da importância que a imaginação tem, a imaginação criativa, a imaginação, inclusive, literária, do ponto de vista de que você tem histórias dentro de histórias, a realidade também importa muito nos dois livros. Os dois livros existem sob o modo realista da narração. Eles são romances bem realistas no sentido... E eles estão ancorados também na história, na medida em que eles incorporam detalhes da paisagem política e social dos lugares onde eles se situam. No caso, essa região de mineração na Nova Zelândia e a pequena cidade norte-americana em New Hampshire, ou na Nova Inglaterra. Então, a pergunta que eu faço agora é justamente sobre essa relação entre realidade e história, ou especificamente o peso relativo que a história tem dentro de romances que tentam subverter um pouco as convenções da ficção histórica, por um lado, no caso de Ellen, e da ficção detetivesca, por outro lado, no caso do Joël. Me parece que há no registro realista ou histórico, há uma certa delicadeza para com o passado, há uma espécie de aspecto inviolável do passado que precisa ser mantido para que o romance faça sentido e o leitor acredite que está vendo a história. Por exemplo, a campanha de Obama no seu romance, ou o aspecto propriamente social e político da zona de mineração e de alguns personagens que ancoram a história no real. Muito embora ela seja mitologicamente organizada sob a estrutura da astrologia e exista no século XIX. Então, eu queria que vocês comentassem um pouco essa existência incontornável do real e do passado dentro do modo de cada um de vocês, quer dizer, o modo detetivesco e o modo histórico. E se há alguma ansiedade da parte de vocês para com isso?
I'd say that for me, there definitely is. That I think the whole notion of reality is not to be trusted. You know, my immediate question that I would want to ask is, well, whose reality and why are they trying to impose it? And I think that this is definitely true of the past, that sometimes we can get lulled into the sense that the view of the past that we now have is supreme in some way. And that the historical movements that have brought us to this point have been, are sometimes, in some way, kind of should have been obvious to the people who were living through those times. I think that's a trap that a lot of historical fiction falls into, in the sense of abusing the hindsight that we have when we look at the past. You know, I think you very often find, for example, you know, a novel set in 1936, and there'll be a character who says, there's something really terrible just around the corner. And this is, I think, an awful thing to do as a novelist, because what you're doing is you're abusing your own powers of hindsight by giving a character prescience of what's going to happen. in order to make us think that that character is in some way, well, prescient, which is it's not prescience because you're abusing your own position, I think. So I think that there are these pitfalls that you can fall into. One of the things I was thinking about with my book particularly is a feature of historical fiction that has always really bothered me, is that you said the word inviolable, the idea that in a work of historical fiction, if, for example, you set a book in the gold rush and somebody makes an enormous strike and finds this huge big nugget that's many kilograms heavy, there's this instinct of the novelist, I think, to destroy the nugget before the book is over, because it doesn't exist in history and so it can't exist in the book. And I read a few books of that kind when I was researching this, and I just got really bothered by them. There was something about it was the sense in which the author was kind of saying that the way that we think things have happened are the way that things probably did happen, which I just have a real problem with because, especially going back 150 years, which my book was, there are so many aspects of life back then that we have no idea about because nobody wrote them down or recorded them in any way. The female experience in New Zealand, for example, is very, you have to imagine a lot of it. Certainly the Chinese experience of Chinese people coming over mostly from southern China to dig on the gold fields. We know so little about their experience. And I think that to treat the past as inviolable is to accept that the narrative that we've received is the one that applies, which I didn't want to do.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you just said, because the book before this one, my fifth book, was set during World War II between 1933 and 1945. And the thing is, when I asked some people to read it, most of them said, but yeah, it's okay, it's a good book, but why did you set the story during a period, a time that you were even born? And how can you be sure that it's really what happened during 1933 and 45? And it seemed to me a very odd question, because it's a period that we're very well documented about and that people can still speak about, because there's still people living that have witnessed this period. And I've even been at a panel with a professor, expert in cooking during the 15th century or the 16th century in France. And she was saying, yeah, in 1515, they were doing this and this. And everybody was like, oh, that's brilliant, that's very interesting. And then it was about my book, and immediately the panel, the other people asked, but how can you be sure that in 1933 it was like this and like this? And I was like, that's crazy, because this lady just spoke about things that were happening 500 years ago, and no one questioned it. And I'm speaking about fact that happened 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and everybody's asking me, but aren't you too young to be sure of that? And that's something that really struck me. That was, how do you define the time set of a story? And that's how I decided to set my story, the next one, in 2008, because it felt for me much more accurate and less matter to questioning, and to have not the readers questioning my credibility as an author. But working on that, I then realized, and it's something that is mentioned by Russell Banks, who said that a storyteller is asking himself 4 questions, which are, where am I coming from? Where am I going to? What am I afraid of? And what am I protecting? And I really feel that all these questions are related to the time frame of a book. And for instance, mine is set in 2008, but the whole story really happens in 1975. And there is this structure between the past and the present, because, of course, the roots of the present action is set in the past, in 1975. And I really do believe that the time frame is what will give the novel a structure and a substance. Because in reality, in the end, what really matters in a novel, it's not really the fact. It's not about the very factual things described in the novel. It's not about the killing or the disappearance of a girl. It's not even about killing a girl. It's about how can that happen? What happened in the mind of the murderers? What happened around the story? And all of this is, of course, only existing because of the time frame, because it's the time frame that will define today, who am I? And in 10 years, it's going to be those 10 other years that will define who I will be. And the question in the end is really not the fact. It's not about who I am. It's not about what am I doing now in Paraty. It's about all the events that came before.
Muito bom. É excelente que você tenha mencionado esse comentário, essa pergunta, mas você não é tão jovem para saber o que aconteceu nos anos, não sei, 30, 70, no século XIX, porque eu queria começar a abrir um pouco mais a discussão. Ela está um pouco severa e baseada quase, parecendo uma aula de pós-graduação, e eu venho para o Brasil um pouco para me desconectar disso. Então eu queria eu comecei a receber perguntas extraordinárias, e eu queria fazer uma última pergunta da parte da moderação, sobre a questão da juventude e do sucesso. Afinal, vocês dois, aos 28 anos, já receberam alguns dos prêmios mais prestigiosos do mundo literário. O Goncourt dos Liceus, o grande prêmio de romance da Academia Francesa, o Man Booker Prize. Então, essa é uma oportunidade rara que nós temos aqui na Flip, para colocar em diálogo dois escritores tão consagrados tão cedo nas suas carreiras, um de língua francesa e outro de língua inglesa, e que escrevem a partir de uma perspectiva que não é, digamos, propriamente central. Afinal, nós temos alguém radicada na Nova Zelândia e outro, digamos, que nos chega a partir de Genebra. Então, eu queria que vocês comentassem, de maneira mais livre e pessoal, como é que vocês veem o futuro das suas profissões como escritores. Como é que vocês se veem daqui a 5 ou 10 anos, tendo em vista que vocês já alcançaram, digamos, tamanha façanha e reconhecimento com esses planos, com esses projetos de romance, e como vocês veem a própria tarefa, ou o futuro do romance de língua francesa e inglesa de agora em diante.
I think, for me, I hope that I keep on writing books that are very different from the ones I've written before. I think that, I would say that I think that the biggest enemy that faces a writer is complacency of any kind. Because complacency equals not caring. And I think that you have to feel things very passionately and believe things very strongly for your writing to work. And I think that one of the things that success can bring in any field is complacency, because you are no longer struggling for recognition, or you're no longer struggling for an audience. And that can be a very dangerous thing, and something you need to treat very cautiously, I think. It's interesting to think about what the writing world will be like in 5-10 years. The arrival of the internet and all sorts of new models for publishing and for distribution that we're seeing now is meaning that everything is in a state of flux. The attitude that general audiences have towards paying for art is changing. I think that, speaking generationally, I would say that a tiny minority of people in my generation think that it's morally wrong, for example, to download something from the internet, like the latest episode of Game of Thrones, for example. That there's something wrong with that. I think that most people think, oh yeah, all right, but I'll go do it, And I think that has implications for authors everywhere, as does the changing face of publishing. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And I'm not really sure if I can kind of make any kind of prophetic statements about what will happen. I don't know if you have any feelings about that.
No, it's true. it's a weird feeling because we're evolving in a very fast world, going in many directions, and some of them, not to say most, but some of them seem quite bad. For instance, I keep hearing that instead of here in Brazil, I keep hearing that in the rest of the world, the book market is going down, which is very worrying. I keep hearing that bookshops are closing. I just heard that in Montreal, the big chapter shop is going to close for Victoria's Secret shop, which is very nice. But you see what I mean. We are struggling about books. And for me, it's a big concern because I'm really wondering, even though when I hear, for instance, Philippe Roth saying that people will no longer read in 10 years or 20 years, it's very concerning about our duty. And I don't really know. What is sure is having this award is, of course, very, very pleasing and very nice and very good for the ego, but I guess it's not the point. There's also a duty by getting it to keep taking our generation to these dreams we have. We can be an author, we can dream, we can be an artist, we can believe in our future. This is not only about pollution, war, economic crisis. This is also about dreaming. Dream big or go home. And I think that we have the duty today, after these awards, as you just said, not to stop and just say, oh, I get it, it's done. We have the duty, which is quite difficult, but to take the young generation, our generation with us, and to try to push them from behind to make them dream. And I think that the most, and I'm very pleased with the French Academy and etc., but I think that the most rewarding thing that happened to me with my book is going to some difficult neighborhood in Paris, visiting some high school where the teachers told me, we have these kids, hopeless kids. We're not believing in them reading one book. Believe it or not, they read your book, they loved it. Some of them want to read more, and some even want to write a book now. And I said, that's what matters today. It's not about fame or glory or success or blah, blah, blah. It's about what, in a very modest, our very modest contribution, what can we do for our generation? And I think our duty today is to keep dreaming, keep writing, and keep going on.
Nessa mesma direção, nós recebemos uma pergunta da plateia, que vem de Janaína, endereçada aos dois escritores. E eu vou ler a pergunta da melhor maneira possível. Tanto a literatura neozelandesa quanto a suíça não têm projeção global como a literatura dos Estados Unidos, da Inglaterra ou de outros países europeus. Vocês acham uma coincidência que dois autores tão jovens estejam trazendo os holofotes para o cenário literário dos seus países, ou acham que isso seja uma tendência, ou seja, a voz jovem ser mais global hoje em dia do que antes?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that for me, New Zealand is a relatively small, pretty enormously small country, really. It's just under 5 million is the total population. And I think that because it's such a small community, the ceiling of national recognition is relatively low, which means that, in a funny kind of way, I think it encourages young people to give things a go, because getting to the top is achievable. And so I think it's a very encouraging place to be a young person. It's a place where the sense is, I think, that you could change the way that the country is. And I don't get that sense when I go to, for example, when I go to London. I feel very differently about my age when I'm there. But I've forgotten the first part of that question. Oh, sorry.
Perguntas longas. sobre a projeção global de literaturas neozelandesa e suíça, e se você atribui ao fato de vocês serem tão jovens o sucesso obtido até agora.
Oh, I see. Well, I think that there is one thing that youth has going for it, which is rebellion, and being dissatisfied and not being conservative. You know, not feeling like you have anything to protect yet, but instead that you want to kind of ask questions and rattle the bars of the cage a little bit. And I think that historically that's always been true. So I think that's, you know, that's maybe something to take on board. But I think that in literature the attitude towards youth and young writers is changing massively with as the publishing world changes. And my sense is that the music industry, the publishing industry, and the film industry are becoming more and more alike, in the sense that publishers are on the lookout for somebody to break out and are kind of, you know, hoovering up all sorts of potential debut breakouts. And the one that truly does break out ends up breaking out in a stratospheric way, and that everybody else kind of doesn't get a second chance, you know, which is even when compared to one generation back, very, very different to how the publishing world used to work. I've heard a lot of writers of the generation above mine talk about the fact that if they had been published today, their careers would have looked completely different, because this idea of taking, you know, 5 or 6 books in order to slowly develop and mature a style is no longer the way that it works anymore. But then it's not the whole picture, you know, because you're only looking at a couple of people, I suppose, if that's, yeah.
Yeah, I will just add that on my side in Europe, the thing is in the last 20 years, Europe completely changed. And for instance, I've spoken with a lot of Swiss authors, 20 years older than I am, who just told me, we would have not be able to do what you just did, which is writing a book, setting a book outside Switzerland and being published by a French publishing house, because for them it was impossible 20 years ago, because each state in Europe was very like independence. 20 years after, it's one big European union. We all pay with the same currency, except in Geneva, Switzerland. But the thing is, we don't have this question anymore, because we can travel very easily, we can move very easily, and if we can move very easily, we can also move and set the story very easily outside the country we are from.
Temos outra pergunta, e como temos pouco tempo, eu vou escolher uma curtinha dessa vez. Eu sei que eu pedi perguntas longas, mas me arrependi. Então, para os dois. A pergunta nos vem da parte de Silvia. Vocês acham que é muito arriscado para um jovem escritor começar com um livro muito extenso e detalhado?
Yes.
I agree.
Wow.
But I think risk is always worth it. I think that if you risk things for the right reasons, then you know it'll reach a happy ending. I think that when people risk things for the wrong reasons, they're not. You can't quite truly call them risks.
I agree.
Muito bem. Perguntas curtas, respostas curtas, excelente. Estamos na época do Twitter, tem que ser assim, né? Então, eu escolho outra pergunta sobre a formação do escritor, que nos vem da parte de uma pessoa anônima. Queria que vocês falassem sobre como é desenvolver projetos de literatura, como um romance, numa comunidade de escritores, como, por exemplo, o programa de Iowa ou outros workshops. Aliás, essa é uma pergunta perigosa, porque Ellie conheceu o marido em Iowa, no programa de escritores residentes. Então, como a verba era pública, eles tiveram que casar. E é muito perigoso essa coisa de workshop de escritor.
Well, I think that a community is a wonderful thing. And friendships, relationships with writers has played an enormous part in shaping me as a writer. I think that creativity needs dialogue. I think it feeds on dialogue. So many of my beliefs are my beliefs because I began believing the opposite, and then I got told by somebody that I was an idiot, and we had an argument about that for a day or a week or a month, and then I realized that they were right, and so I think that's something that a writing community can give to a person, but it doesn't need to be a whole community. It can be one other person. If you have a person in your life who you can have dialogue with, who you can test your ideas on and show your work to, and also listen to, truly listen to, then I think that's all you need.
I disagree. No, I mean, it's very funny because coming from the French book industry, we absolutely don't have no creative workshop stuff. It does not exist. There's a very few, but it's not very well seen. So the concept is just to be alone and not share any ideas at all. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting to hear it, because for me, I don't really share any ideas, concept, anything in any community. As an author, and it's the same for all the author I know coming from the French industry, if I can say so. It's something very, very particulate, because it's supposed to be something that you do by yourself and that you not really talk about, besides maybe of your publisher. That's it. We don't even have agent in France, so it's very different, and it's more lonely, I would say.
Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta. Como o Paulo me escreveu aqui, Zé, a mesa está um pouco fria, eu quero ver sangue. Então, e o sangue... eu acho que o coração bate mais rápido, por exemplo, quando você tem que enfrentar a tradução ou a falta de tradução das suas obras. Nos dois casos, nós temos 2 livros que estão sendo vastamente traduzidos. Hoje, durante o almoço, Ellie confessou, ela ficou vermelha, riu, mas acabou confessando, que a tradução francesa havia encontrado inconsistências e erros fatuais no original. Então, eu queria que, por um lado, você comentasse que descoberta embaraçosa foi essa, que agora você deve aos tradutores, à tradutora francesa. E para Joël, no seu caso, o seu livro, na verdade, é um romance americano. Como foi você ler a história que você escreveu em francês, situada nos Estados Unidos, em inglês? Modifica, você interfere, encontrou, digamos, você desenvolveu com a história uma outra relação a partir da tradução para a língua inglesa? So, the embarrassing moments.
Oh, there are quite literally almost too many to name. I'm trying to think of particularly embarrassing things. My French translator is an absolute, top of her game. She's an absolutely wonderful translator, and she would send me emails just full of all sorts of questions like, on this page you have somebody putting on a collarless waistcoat, a waistcoat without a collar, and then on the next page you have his friend grabbing him by the collar. And so there are those kinds of inconsistencies. And also just factual errors, like things that I I got wrong. The Tasman Sea, which is the sea between New Zealand and Australia, I refer to very frequently in this book, and was informed by my French translator that it wasn't named until the 1890s, for example. So there's all those kinds of things. But I think that I do feel quite cheerful about them, because the book is an invention, and I don't think that people go to fiction for facts. I think that they go to fiction for truth, which is a very different, a different enterprise.
I fully support you. I fully support you because there is, in my book as well, many little facts that were understressed by the translators. And the thing is, it's very different. It's not about the book is set in the 18th or the 19th century or in New Zealand or Switzerland. It's about things that we don't even know. For instance, the Wi-Fi. Where the Wi-Fi 5 years ago? I don't even know. I mean, it seems so evident for me. Or the cell phones. How was the situation with the cell phones 10 years ago, 15 years ago? And it's very confusing, and it's things that are very close to us. So, I mean, it's not about a bad work in the building of the book. It's really little facts that are very difficult for us to check because it's so obvious or so not. And for instance, in mine, it was very funny for me to read the American version of the book because it was a different book for me. It was a different voice. But it was also very interesting because, for instance, I was mentioning Nola watching the sunset from the East Coast. And some people said, but how come? It's the East Coast. There's no sunset for sure. And I was like, that's very weird because I remember very vividly being in Maine and seeing like the sunset. So there's something wrong. And I realized I tried to find out, and I realized that the place I used to go to Maine is a kind of island facing the west. So it's on the east, but facing the west, so you can see the sunset. And so there's a little thing like that are very obvious. It was so obvious for me that you can see the sunset on the East Coast since people say no, because it's facing east, which is obvious now.
Muito bem. Bom, Ellie, muito obrigado. Joël, muito obrigado. Obrigado. Obrigado a todos vocês pela participação na mesa número 3 e a Paulo Werneck pelo convite para a moderação. Boa, Flip. Autógrafos. Os autores vão... legal, foi bom. Foi bom.